Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, Remembrance Veterans Day, a memorial to the animals that served, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Kristina Disney. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Over to you, Kristina.
Thank you so much, Rob. It's exciting to be back. So yes, my name is Kristina Disney. I've been an expedition leader with Natural Habitat since 2018, 2019. And today you're joining me. We're going to do a webinar that's a little bit different from maybe what you're used to in our daily doses. Considering that today is November 11th, and I was lucky enough to get assigned today as a webinar, I wanted to take the time to focus on that and maybe to think about it in a way that we're not used to. For Canada, this is a statutory holiday, and it was originally called Armistice Day, right? This started at the end of 1919, at the end of World War I, celebrating on the 11th hour of the 11th month, or 11th day of the 11th hour of the 11th month, in terms of the end of the war. And we've continued this tradition, more than 100 years later, and it's come to include not just World War I, but all of our veterans throughout the years. And so I wanted to take a look at that. And just to start off, I by no means want to take away from those who have served their country. This day is certainly still the primary focus is on them. And to them, I still pay so much respect. But my intentions with this presentation are more so for my personal self to not let this day go by unmarked. This is something I can do to consciously set aside the time to dig into history and take what I've learned and share it with you as well. So that's really it. The other thing is I think it's an opportunity to take a look at the general unfortunate devastation of war. When human conflict happens, we don't exist in isolation. We affect our ecosystems, we affect both the animals that we live with as well as the wildlife, right? When we talk about human war, we often talk about civilian casualties versus active zones and things like that. And the animals that we live with and that share our lives and often our livelihoods are taken into that with us, often without choice. And so the point I want to start from there is conscription, actually. In the same way that our soldiers were conscripted through various wars, the animals were as well, right? They would have been brought with them to haul supplies, used for messengers, and not just supplies, they would have been taking along a lot of the ammunition, right? So, and not exactly the most lovely conditions. They had to share the same difficulties as our soldiers. And so when I started looking into this, I actually found a memorial that exists in London. If you go to Hyde Park, you'd be able to see this. And it's a description of two mules, or excuse me, it's a sculpture of two mules. And in the background, you can see there's a whole other bunch of animals that you wouldn't necessarily think to associate with war. In the back, you can see obviously the horses, but there's camels, elephants, goats, dogs, and there's a small inscription on this. And if you ever happen to go there, you'll find the inscription reads, "They had no choice." And so I think that's, it reflects not just our human conscription, but also the animals that went to war with us, right? So when we think about World War I, the war to end all wars, nearly 10 million soldiers sacrificed their lives in that between 1914 and 1918, excuse me. And, the animals were there side by side with them. They paid a huge price as well and shouldered a lot of that burden. And so when we think about this, World War I represents a really interesting crossover point because it's just at the era of mechanization, right? So using animals in war is certainly nothing new. If we take a stroll through history, I'm getting ahead of myself. So backtracking tiny bit. So World War I, there were more than 16 million animals that served in the war. They were used for transport, communication, oftentimes even just companionship was the huge drive. And so when we think about that, there's a huge, I guess, crossover between past and present, right? So thinking about the past now, I'm going to take us way, way back. So 2,500 years ago, right? There's examples of this all through, but I picked a few to sort of exemplify how humans have always taken animals with them and made that possible. So 2,500 years ago, there's a Syrian king, or what is now Syria, and he was the capital of Kadesh, and the pharaoh Thutmose III was attacking his city. And what he actually did was he released mares who were in heat into the pharaoh's chariots, where there was a bunch of stallions. It caused a huge amount of chaos, and it actually changed the turn of that invasion, right? So horses we're used to thinking about, I think, in our general frame of mind as far as something, but one that we maybe in Western culture don't think about as often is elephants' use in war. These were certainly used by the Persians, the Romans as well. They were used as troop carriers, battering rams, and so a huge, huge force. And same as the very, very big also comes with the very, very small. So there was the Romans had very, very unfortunate luck when it came to bees in use of warfare, and it was mostly by their enemies. There was a Greek city that the Romans were trying to take called Thermopylae. It was 72 BC, and they essentially they had a walled city, and the Romans were trying to tunnel under the wall. And as the city was actually famous for its honey production, and so as they were building the tunnels, the Greeks built holes, dug holes to meet them, and actually dropped the hives underneath, which caused the Romans to be trapped on the wall and stung by bees, which is a huge turning point in that war. So it's not anything new, and this is another one a little bit closer now in history. This is there was an example from 1671. There was Sir Henry Morgan, as he would later become, but if we think about Captain Morgan, if that's familiar maybe a little bit more, was attacking Panama, the city of Panama. And he actually had about 1,000 pirates under his command, and the city, the civilians actually they didn't have much force to fight back with, so they used wild cattle to stampede the attacking pirates. Now, depending on which side of that war you are more biased to, you would see that they oh, excuse me, my computer's asking me for something. There we go. They actually didn't, the pirates didn't win the war. It was the Panamans the Panamans didn't win. The pirates ended up conquering the city. So, little delve through history. But when we get back to that, so in World War I, which is the focus of this presentation, there was over 16 million animals used in the war, and approximately 9 million of them passed away. Out of those 9 million, 8 million were horses, primarily used, but several also would have been dogs. So I said earlier that 10 million soldiers passed away, right? And so when we think about that, when we think about what that war did, not only to our culture and our survival, right, there was nearly a life for life there. And those animals that we took along to war with us are often domesticated, right? So their lot is thrown in with ours, regardless of which side of the war they found themselves on. And I think in today's era, in today's age, we often forget, or maybe, it's just not as close to our minds as what it was, the reasons that they actually were enlisted and brought with them for that. So today, you and I, a lot of the jobs that those animals would have filled during World War I, we now, we have machines do those things. Often, actually, it's things that it's things about communication we now do with a swipe of a button on our phone. So the world has changed a lot in the last 100 years. But if you were a soldier, a companion you would have often had with you in very many different aspects would have been dogs. So the U.S. War Dogs Association estimates there was about 20,000 dogs used on the Allied side and about 30,000 dogs used on the Central Powers side during World War I. As far as breeds, we were looking at things like Collies, Shepherds, obviously the German Shepherd, Retrievers, Terriers were a really big one. These were breeds that were really responsive and could be trained really quite well. And they could have been doing anything from guarding, messaging, digging up victims, things like that. So the guard dogs were actually trained not to bark upon intruders, right? They were trained to silently alert their handler that there was something coming, whether that, some of them would have been trained for spies trying to steal into camp, or they also would have been guarding things like the supply trains. One that I think we often forget about is that dogs were also used for hauling things and for transport, right? So a lot of dogs would have been hauling machine guns around, right? Because they could cover the same amount of ground, get into smaller places than necessarily a horse could. And weight-wise and resource-wise, if you think about it, it was much easier to care for a dog than it was to care for a 1,200-pound horse. And of course, dogs were used for rescuing. The picture on the right that you're seeing is an Italian team of rescuers that were used to train, used in the mountains and recovery. And again, in modern terms, the rat catcher was a very, very common role for the dog, especially in the trenches. And we think of rats as nuisances now, but when you were in the trenches and life was already nearly unbearable, and you had your supplies being eaten by rats, your food rations that were so precious, having them picked away. So the dogs were often trained to take care of that, and so it was also another reason for them to be able to keep them as a companion, right, to fill that role. The French had a very specific trained dog they called mercy dogs, is what they would translate into. They would spend months training these dogs to be essentially mobile medics. The dogs were trained to go into no man's land, to find injured soldiers and to stay with them, either until a human medic was able to come, but the dogs also carried a first aid kit on them, because since most soldiers were going to be trained in basic first aid, the dogs also, if the soldiers weren't going to make it, the dogs often stayed with them until their passing moment, which just goes to show their innate sixth sense when it comes to caring for us and them. Horses most commonly were used for transport, and water, ammunition, you name it, medical supplies. And in the same way that the soldiers were trying to protect themselves from gas attacks, the horses were often had the same concept, right? This one you can see as a bag. They've developed more specific gas masks for them, which is what they were worried about, was the mustard gas. Mules and things like mules were used more so on more rocky terrain. So these ones are actually in Morocco here. And as far as hauling supplies to the front line. Now, in the same way that when the soldiers were getting shipped out, the horses had to be shipped out as well. It's an interesting one to note because, the soldiers came in from all around the world to fight in Europe. And so horses were supplied from all around the globe as well, but dogs wouldn't have been. It took several years before the army believed that it was worth the resources to bring dogs along. So you can sort of see that exception there. So the horses, when they were shipped out, most of them were coming from the US. The British had more than 500,000 horses brought over. And between, I think, 1914 and 1917, they were shipping out 1,000 horses every single day for Europe to fight in the war. And it was a world war, right? It covered huge tracts of different countries. And so when we get to those warmer, hotter climates, camels were used as well. This picture is actually from the northwest frontier of India in 1917. And those tents that you see are actually carrying injured soldiers back from the front line. Also, camels make sense. They would be way more efficient. They could still carry heavy loads, but you wouldn't have the same water needs as if you'd had a horse in the desert. And one that we don't think about, I think, is that elephants were still used in World War I as well. So this picture is actually of an elephant in Germany, and it was donated from a zoo to help move logs. So not only were they used in India to haul around heavy equipment. They were actually used a lot in building bridges, right? If you think about the structural need and the timber that you would need to move for that, elephants were able to get down into those smaller dirt roads, places you maybe couldn't drive, and really haul in that lumber. They also were used in cleanup post-war. So this is actually 2 elephants from a circus, and they were used in bomb cleanup and clearing roadways. And they continued doing it even after the war was over. These elephants stayed at it for, I think, 5 or 6 years following the war. This picture was taken 6 months after the end of the war. One that none of us, I certainly didn't think of, was the employment of glowworms, especially for those who were tunneling. So officially it was thought of by the Allies, but most of the references show that it was the Australian soldiers that came to fight that thought of this. So they were the ones that often had to dig the tunnels and the trenches. And so in order to provide light for themselves that wouldn't draw attention, they would often pack 10, 20 glowworms into a jar, and then they would shake the jar at night. Supposedly that was enough light for them to be able to read their maps, all in the cover of darkness without having a heat source, which is a huge, very clever tactic, I gotta say. And again, when we think about the era, pigeons were still used as a main mode of communication, right? The radio was only just becoming commonplace in World War I. So when we think about it, what they would sometimes do is they would have, they would fly back to headquarters, or they would release massive amounts and hope that some of them would make it. It very much depended on the scenario. So there was most likely somewhere around 200,000 pigeons still in use as messengers during World War I, which I think is just crazy. This might be familiar, this bird is probably familiar as the canary in the coal mine, right? But it wasn't in the same way that miners would use these birds. Again, those tunnel diggers, right? They really had to be concerned about gas getting trapped down there. And so if you look just sort of bottom left-ish, you can see some cages. So they would have kept canaries, they would have kept rodents, things like that, to help them make sure that the air was clean enough to keep digging. And of course, one of their most primary roles was as companions. I think, they would, it was interesting because in the beginning, the US wouldn't allow people to bring service dogs. And that rule sort of changed a little bit as time went by, because people would smuggle them in, they would convince their commanding officer to keep them as mascots. And I think that really the reflection of that is that it really shows that we need those companions, right? There's something to having an animal with you in a really dark time that makes it so much better. It makes you more human just by their presence. And some of those companions, again, maybe wouldn't be what you think. He was nicknamed Sergeant Billy. A group of Canadian soldiers picked him up on the train in Saskatchewan on the way through to base camp training, and they kept him, and he made it all the way to the front line. And Billy actually saved 3 soldiers' lives by head bunting them into a trench just as shrapnel was about to explode. So he earned his stripes, you might say. Kangaroos were actually brought in, not individually, but they actually brought into medical tents and recovery centers because they brought so much joy to the patients, right? There's something to being sick and having something else to care for that brings you back to life. And there's also a bit of, for some of the homesickness that the Australian soldiers would have had at that time. There was actually a medal created for animals that served during war. It was created World War II, so those post after World War I, and some animals from World War I were given it posthumously, I guess. And it was created by a woman named Maria Dickin, and essentially it was in honor of all these animals who had shown unquestionable duty. You could say it's the equivalent of the Animal Victoria Cross. And most of the animals that were given it were horses, dogs, pigeons. There was one cat for who was awarded this. And for me, what this medal comes to stand for is that, this is actually a line from Winnie the Pooh, but you're braver than you believe, you're stronger than you seem. In the face of adversity, there are exceptional individuals who inspire us to be better than what we are now. And sometimes those individuals are in the animal kingdom and they have 4 legs. So I would like to take the time to focus on a few of the more exceptional stories that have come to pass. In World War I, there was an Airedale Terrier named Jack, and Jack was with his platoon, with his unit, and they were under a huge amount of heavy fire. And it was a British group. They were the Sherwood Foresters, so they're the ones that would have been advanced going in and sort of scouting things out, and they got trapped. And they were only maybe half a mile from their headquarters. And so they tried to send runners out. They couldn't make it, and so they sent Jack. And Jack had a message tied around his neck, and Jack ran the half a mile through barbed wire, through enemy fire, and he made it all the way back to his receiving handler, who he collapsed at his feet upon dropping the message, and he passed away. But he made it in time, and he saved all of those men's lives. And I often think, this is just one dog and one story, but how many stories like that exist? Of course, dogs were used in search and rescue. So the dog on the left you're looking at is a dog named Rip. He was a stray. Both these dogs here from World War II. So I'm going to jump around from some stories sort of all throughout the wars in the last few years. And so he actually, during the Blitz, was responsible for finding several people in the debris. The dog on the right was named Jet. Jet and his handler found more than 150 people buried in the rubble. And Jet once sat 12 hours waiting for search and rescue to come to find the woman that he had found underneath there. So both these dogs received the Dickens Medal, and I would say that for the lives they saved, they certainly earned it. His name was the Soldier Bear. It would be Wojciech, although my Polish isn't very good. And he was picked up by a Polish battalion when they were traveling through Iran. And he actually was given status so that he could have rations. They took him with them all the way to the front line, and his job was to carry ammunition and supplies to the front. And so he grew to be over 6 feet tall. He would play wrestle with the men, and it's something else that they actually gave him his own name tag, right? He was considered a soldier in the army so that he could have the right to be there with them and not get sent home. This dog here is arguably one of the most famous, most decorated dogs to come out of the World War I. His name was Stubby. He was a stray who showed up in Yale, where the men were training, and there was a Private Conroy who found him and befriended him, and he wanted to take him with him. But at the time, the Army didn't allow service dogs to go. And so when it came time to ship out to Europe, Conroy actually had one of the engine room men on the ship smuggle him into the coal room, and he stayed in there the whole time, the whole crossing. And then when Conroy made it over, he hid the dog in his jacket, and he actually, when it eventually made it to Europe and made it to Britain, he convinced his commanding officer to keep the dog, and Stubby would go on to prove time and time again that he was worth it. So he once caught a German spy that was sneaking into their camp. The German spy was completely dressed as an American soldier, and Stubby could tell, as dog senses often do. He was trained to bark and nip when he could hear, right? Dog's sense of hearing is way better than ours. Whenever he could hear bomb shells coming, gas, things like that. He once woke up a sleeping man where the gas was about to smother and suffocate him. And what else did Stubby do? He went missing for a whole month and returned. No one knows where or how he survived on his own, but he came back. And he survived the war. He came back to the U.S. and he eventually passed away. But he became the mascot for a law school in Washington. But the thing that I loved the most about Stubby's story was that they were interviewing Conroy's grandson years later about the dog. And as most soldiers who come back, Conroy never wanted to talk about it. you know, his children, his grandchildren ask him, you know, Grandpa, what happened in the war? What was it like? And he never wanted to talk about it. The only thing he would tell his children was that I was with Stubby. And I think that one sentence goes to show, for all the valor, for all the courage that this dog had, it's amazing that he changed that one man's life, right? There's so much value to that in and of itself. And I mentioned pigeons before, but this one is a very special pigeon. His name was Cher Ami, and Cher Ami was the reason that more than 200 men survived an attack. What happened was there was a unit that actually made it on the wrong side of enemy lines, and so they were behind enemy lines, and there was a miscommunication from the Allied forces, the other American troops behind them, and so they were receiving friendly fire. And so they're being fired on from both sides because of this hillside that they were on. There was a miscommunication. And so the officer in charge, a guy named Major Charles White, he sent out the first pigeon, and the first message said, "There's many wounded, we can't evacuate." And the pigeon was shot down by the Germans. And then he sent out the second message saying, "Men are suffering, please send support." And again, the second pigeon never made it, it was shot down. They then sent out the third pigeon named Cher Ami, and they actually had run out of supplies, so they wrote the message on an onion skin, and the message said, "We're along the parallel road to 267. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop." And when the pigeon took off, within a minute, it was actually shot by the Germans, and the men thought that all hope was lost. And the pigeon got back in the air, flew all the way. It flew 25 miles to headquarters in under 30 minutes, made it back to its receiver, where it had lost an eye, had a broken off leg, and was shot through the breast, and dropped off this message. And because of that, 194 men survived. So this pigeon was one of the ones who was then given the award for the lives that it saved. This horse is actually from 1953. Her name was Reckless. She was named that in honor of the gun that she carried around. So she was in the Korean War, and I think the amazing thing about her was that she was actually bought from a Korean who needed money to help his sister, and it was supposed to be a racehorse. And the officer in charge recognized him and a few other guys that had grown up on farms, and they knew that they could work with her. She was bright, she was intelligent, and so they trained her to haul the machine gun, which they also trained her to lie down under fire. They trained her to run away when when they were receiving enemy fire. But the most amazing day that she had was, there was a day where she made over 50 trips. She was hauling supplies and ammunition into the front line, and she was hauling wounded soldiers back. And so in the beginning, when she was making these treks, they had a soldier leading her. But by the end, they'd had so many casualties, they couldn't afford to set anyone aside. And so Reckless, on her own, walked, I think it was about 5 or 6 miles round trip, and she made the trip time and time again, and she would haul out injured soldiers, and she would haul supplies back, and there was no one leading her. She did those trips completely solo. And she went on to actually be promoted to sergeant, and her unit didn't take it as a joke. Anyone was forbid to ride her, and if any other unit started making jokes at her expense, it was a huge taboo. They started more than one fight over it. And yeah, she was their prized possession and friend for the number of times that she had saved their life. These are just a few amazing stories. I am sure that if you were to go digging, you would find thousands more, or at least not tiny moments, right? Anyone who's grown up with animals, who spend time with them, they change us for the better, right? They help us get through dark days. And in the same way, I think that we have to remember what it was like. When we talk about war, we tend to just think about the big picture, right? But for every person who was in that war, it was a very real, very terrible experience, right? They had day to day to live through it. It's not just a story they told, and the conditions were often horrific. Poor training, poor housing, maybe not the best gear, low supplies. And so in in the same conditions that people had to go through, the animals were there side by side. And thinking about rationing, right? So if you're a horse, you usually need to drink about 30 liters in a day. And there were times when the horses would go more than 60 hours without any water, and they still had to carry 130 kilograms of pack weight. So that's, you're looking at, more than 200, 300 pounds day after day, they're putting this off. And so I mentioned that the US sent horses, they sent about 500,000 to Europe, but the Australians also sent horses. They sent 130,000 horses for World War I. And out of those 130,000 horses, only a single horse made it back to Australia, which I think goes to show the devastation and the lives that were lost there. So this image isn't from World War I. This is actually a picture of the bison skulls that were collected on the prairies, and that would then be shipped out. And the reason why I brought this image up is because I find that when we talk about numbers like this, it's really hard to really understand what that means. And so, having grown up on the prairies, this is an image I'd grown up sort of seeing in history books, but it really, even as a kid and even now, it brings home what each one of those lives really means, right? And the changes that it's changed. And so when I think about World War I, it represents an interesting point, because as technologies have advanced, we'll likely never have a war that has so many animals used in it again, right? We have drones now. We've mechanized so many things. But I think that it's important to remember that our wars don't exist in isolation. Listed here is several wars, certainly not all of them, since World War I. And, we don't often think about or even know to talk about the wildlife that we affect when we have conflict. So when I think about it, when we think about it, wildlife often has to deal with the leftover landmines that stay in regions. They often are hunted and killed for supply, for food, but also, to fund war efforts. Another thing that we don't really talk about, right? Using that in exchange to pick up weapons. And often, in hard times, we can understand why, people start hunting things and they need to survive. But then even once those hard times pass, that still becomes a habit, right? It's something that's ingrained in the culture then. And so these effects go just beyond the conflict themselves. And there's an interesting study by Danskin and Pringle from 2018, and they talk about how, if you look at the conflict from 1946 to 2010, and if we look at the decline or rise, or the biggest predictor of wildlife populations, the strongest predictor in these protected areas in Africa of whether wildlife populations are stable, it has to do with conflict. And so this isn't, it's not the world we think about and we live in, but I think it's one that we need to remember still exists and still happens. The other thing to keep in mind is that it's not just limited to land. We still affect marine wildlife when we're at war, and it's maybe not as obvious, but whales undergo decompression sickness because they rise too soon, right? They get frightened at depth and they come to the surface, and in the same way that as you and I as divers, if we come too fast, we get the bends. The whales will go through the same thing. They have to deal with noise. We don't think about noise as a pollution very much. We tend to acclimatize to it as humans, but if you're a whale, you live very much in isolation from the rest of your species, but you communicate via sound over crazy distances. And so this added noise to the ocean has huge effects on them. There's also cases of mass strandings of whales where we're finding, naval exercises have caused them to beach themselves from stress. So it's a worldwide issue that goes on, and it's something we still need to think about. So the world is a very different place than from what it was 100 years ago. And I'm very, very grateful for those who laid down their lives so that it could be what it is today. And if you're listening, I hope that you will set aside some time today to actively pay that respect. And I also hope that what I hope we all walk away from here is that our actions as humans are not in isolation. We, especially our conflicts, we affect our ecosystems, we affect domesticated species, we affect wildlife, and you know, we take that conflict with us beyond our own spheres. So I realize I went a bit faster than I normally do, but thank you so much for your time. Thank you for listening. And thank you so much for the soldiers that served. I appreciate you. And I've had several members of my family, so it's near and dear to me today. So thank you so much, and I'll pass that back to Rob.
Thank you, Kristina. Now, before we start the question and answer session, I'd like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. So let's go ahead and get to the questions. We don't have too many right at the moment, but mostly people are really thanking you for this absolutely wonderful presentation. Let's talk about the horses that America shipped back and forth. Did they indeed bring the horses back to the United States? I know you said that one horse went back to Australia, but do many of these animals get to go home afterwards?
So I don't have the numbers for the US, but in general, what happened after when World War I was in conclusion, the animals that survived, to be quite frank, a lot of them were used for food, especially horses. If you think about the supplies that would have been so low in Europe, a lot of them were used to feed the people who were still there. Some of them were actually sent on to fight in India, as well as Palestine and a few other locations. It was an exception to be a horse that got to come home. There's a few stories of them. When you think about the numbers that have gone over, you know, less than a few thousand came back, and often they were at, you know, huge urging from the people who had lived with them. There's a couple of famous horses. There's Warhorse. There's a few other ones that, you know, they went back and essentially got to retire, but that wasn't unfortunately the norm.
What about Jeremy, the pigeon? What happened after he got back? Did he live?
He did. So this is really cool. So he survived the bullet hole, the missing eye, and the one leg. He was a one-legged pigeon, and after he came back from that, he was actually sent to the US, and he got to live out his life quite happily. So there's one happy story.
That is a happy ending out, isn't it? What about elephants? How many elephants perished during these terrible wars?
So that one's the numbers of the animals used outside of Europe is a lot harder to get a hold of. The other thing is that they would have, in World War I, they wouldn't have been used as frontline animals. They would have mostly been used in construction and things like that. So living conditions probably still would have been quite harsh, but they would still probably be able to carry out a semi-normal lifespan. So I would say that the numbers of elephants perishing would be rather low, relatively speaking, but unfortunately I don't have whole numbers. The ones that are used in Europe weren't ones, to me it's just like I never even thought of beforehand, right? But they recruited them from like their zoos and circuses. All those resources are still in Europe at the time, right? And it costs money to feed them. And so the army essentially just conscripted those and was like, yep, we're taking those now, which was such an interesting perspective I hadn't even thought of until now. So yeah, crazy to think about.
So I'm curious, do you know if with basically the dogs that were over in Europe, did they try to find homes for these animals before they left, or did they just let them run wild?
Yeah, I think it would depend on resources. So most of the dogs that were in active service would have stayed with their platoon. Just resource wise, it's not as much to bring a dog or to travel around with them. I mean, this isn't specifically to active dog services, but in World War II, this is actually quite terrible. nearly 100,000 pets were actually killed just before the Blitz, and not in service, but because of rationing. They actually killed a huge number of pets throughout like London because they didn't have enough food for them. So it's yeah, it's a bit brutal. I don't begrudge anyone the actions that they did, right? Everyone was trying to do the best that they can in really tough times, but unfortunately it's not quite the happy story.
Do you know how animals are used today by militaries? I know a lot of them have been replaced by machines, but can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, so there's some, I kind of wanted to cover it, and I guess I could have had time. But so there's really cool things that still happen, because there's things that, for all our technology, there's things that humans still can't even comprehend. A big one are things like pheromones, our sense of smell, even our lab equipment to use these things. We still don't have the same intuition that animals do. So today, quite commonly, there's a lot of rodents that are trained for finding mines and things like that in South Africa. It's like a jumping, it's like a kangaroo rat, I think, is the big one that they have in South Africa. Dolphins are still used as for mine detection. So they'll have the sonar, and the dolphin is trained to have like present absence calls to their person. So they'll come back and they can actually track mines, and then the dolphin is then trained to go and drop a buoy where they find the mine in the water, which is pretty cool. And I mean, they're still definitely used as guard dogs, as security dogs, things like that. So I had a friend who actually trains, this isn't for the military, but they train service dogs, right? And I never knew this until spending time with them. But if a dog doesn't have a high enough caliber of attention to be a companion service dog, then they often, they find other roles for them. And so, because it requires the thing about it is like you have to have a really strong attention span to be a service dog that's committed to taking care of a human. And so lots of those actually become bomb dogs if they don't, because it's a shorter requirement of attention span. They're still highly intelligent, but just like you and I have, they have personalities and preferences, right? So the dogs that I used to hang out with became bomb dogs.
Wow, so interesting. So I know that especially during these wars, more modern times, I know some animals are, or they were conscripted and taken away from owners. Did the owners have the right to say no to having their horses or dogs taken, or did they get compensated? You know how that worked?
More often than not, they were just taken. It's especially in Europe. The US there would have been a compensation fee for them. So like a lot of breeders amped it up during World War One, especially the Midwest and things like that. They were getting paid for those. It probably would have been at a set military rate. I don't know if you were to convert that into today's money, whether it would, be considered a good price or not. So those would have been, but for animals in Europe, it would have just been it would have been a free for all.
So it was really interesting to hear that they used glowworms. Are any other insects used now, or were they used before?
I don't know, maybe intentionally or not. There's some other, so like World War II, this isn't insects, that was bats. I'm trying to think. Like besides, there's the odd story of like purpose infestation to get, armies uncomfortable or to get them move or things like that. But I can't think of any other specific ones necessarily besides, there was actually, I forgot about this one. There was a point where the German army was releasing malaria-ridden mosquitoes in, which country was it? I want to say like Belgium or something like that. But they were doing that to get the Allied forces sick. It was an attack thing.
Wow, that's wild.
Yeah.
Now I know in England they do recognize the sacrifice of these animals with a purple poppy, and they have a special day of remembrance. Do you know if any other countries do this?
Not that I'm aware of. Yeah, it's an interesting one. People, as far as splitting resources and splitting time, right? Because you make the argument that, if is it fair to put the time and energy into or I guess, what's the word I'm looking for, right? The time and energy to focus on our fellow humans that could be used for animals or vice versa. Yeah, I think culturally it comes, you have to have the luxury in order to do that, right? So in my mind, not that I can think of, but I could certainly be wrong.
So can you talk a little bit more about the African conflicts and which species were especially depleted by these battles?
Yeah, so it would depend, obviously it depends on where you are, but things like zebras, giraffes, right? So those would have been used as a food source, like when you think about guerrilla warfare. Other animal, right? So another one we maybe don't think about often, right? But selling trophy animals, right? So hunting and selling those and using those, right? So you're thinking about lions, cheetahs, things like that. Even though, you know, the war in theory has nothing, no effect on them, different sides are hunting those in order to pay for the war, their own war efforts. So, you know, think about your big game. Those would be the ones most threatened.
Hmm. Uh, let's talk about Sergeant Reckless for one more minute. Do you know what happened to him after the war?
You know, I don't know what happened to Reckless after the war. I hope that she got to go back, but I know her platoon, yeah, she would have stayed there probably until the end, or she might have stayed in Korea. But yeah, I don't know the end of her story.
Now we saw that huge pile of bones. Do you know what type of animals those were?
Yeah, so the photo that I use as an example is a collection of bison bones. It's the skulls specifically. They would have been collected and left by railways, and they were used for making things like cement and stuff like that in the old days. Because I'm from the prairie, so I guess I thought about this a bit more, but pre-European contact, the prairies would have just been littered with skulls and bones. Right, because if you think about it, there were anywhere between 30 million and 60 million bison rolling the plains. You have that whole migratory population moving around. And so, right, but then Europeans come along and we don't see those anymore because they were all collected at the late 1800s to be used by industry. And so that was a really common sight, you know, late 1800s, early 1900s, to see these big pile of bones, and then they would sell them to the train cars and load them up and ship them out east to be used.
Interesting. So I know there's been research on using dolphins. Were any actually used for messaging, or was it just research, basically?
On the dolphins?
Yeah.
So they're used. So basically there's lots of places where like underwater mines, essentially explosives, are still there. And trying to pull those out is really quite tricky, and to find them. And so even though we have sonar and things like that, the dolphins are actually better at getting at the exact point, right? Like sonar might get you down to 5-10 meters, but when you're going through a field of mines, you don't want to have a 5-10 meter range, right? You want to know exactly where that is. So they're still actively used. I think the US is probably the biggest one for that.
What amazing animals. So let me ask you this. Do you have any books, or can you recommend any reading to us if we want to learn more about this topic?
Yes, there is a book called Tommy's Ark, Tommy's Last Ark. Hang on a second, I'm gonna pull it up. This is what partially what sent me down this train is, and it's a collection of stories of animals. Yeah, Tommy's Ark. It's by Richard Van Emden, Enden. Um, and yeah, it's just different stories of personal accounts of the animals and the lives and the men who served with them.
This has been such a fascinating and interesting discussion, and I'm afraid that's about the last time we have last question we have time for today. So I'm going to throw it back to you, Kristina, just in case you want to wrap something up.
Yeah, thank you all so much for sharing some of your Remembrance or Veterans Day, depending where you are, different names for it, with me. It's been yeah, it's been a really good learning curve for me, and I know whenever I stumble upon something that's really important to me, I appreciate the opportunity that I get to share that with others. So take some time today and enjoy today, right? That's the reason why all this happened. It was so that we could live future happy lives. So take a moment to remember, but remember with a smile too, if you can. So take care, everyone.
Kristina, thank you so much for taking the time to present to us today. And I'd like to also thank everyone who tuned in. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar for today. To all the veterans, thank you for your service, and to all the animals, thank you for your service as well. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.